The prisons are broke, the legislature is starting to work on a budget, and Governor Bruce Rauner is headed to Europe. We talk about it next on Capitol View. Welcome to Capitol View, the weekly program on state government and politics and how it might just affect you. Joining me this week on Capitol View is Mark Maxwell, Capitol Bureau Chief for WCIA Television. Welcome, Mark.
Bruce, thanks for having me.
Also, Brian Mackey, Capitol reporter for Illinois Public Radio. Welcome.
Hello, Bruce.
Great. Well, as we sit here at Capitol View this week, just hours earlier, Governor Bruce Rauner met with the four legislative leaders to talk about, well, presumably money, but perhaps some other things. What emerged from this meeting, and is it something that is going to portend good or ill for the future?
Well, I don't care who goes first.
Well, just toss it out there.
All right, I'll start. So the governor, I think what he wanted to project all this week is an appearance of a man in charge, right? Famously, this is a governor who said he's not in charge. He wants to get to be in charge last year, which both his opponent in the Republican primary and Democrats have been sort of using against him since then. And this is him saying, sort of inserting himself back into the legislative process after last summer's end of the budget impasse, where he was basically sidelined in that. So we saw him sort of trying to reassert control, and what we can talk a little bit later about how the Democrats reacted to that.
But the other takeaway, the small victory, if you will, was the fact that the meeting ever occurred at all.
Sure.
Because even before the legislature moved to override Governor Rauner's veto of a budget, there was a long drought where the governor and the four top leaders in the legislature had not met. I want to say it was 14 to 16 months. It was a really long time, and the fact that those meetings are occurring now with a budget deadline just a few weeks away at least puts them a little bit ahead of where they were this time last year.
Speaking of budget, I mean, one thing that they did emerge saying is that we're going to agree on estimated tax collections as a basis for forming a budget. How unique might that be in Illinois? Is that progress or something else?
Well, a revenue estimate has been rather elusive, or at least controversial. Different parties have wanted to use different numbers, and what they're saying is before we walk into crafting what we all want to be a balanced budget, we have to agree on variable A, which is how much money will the state collect. And they could get it wrong, but they just want to agree. They want to be using the same benchmark, the same number, so that when they start to put this whole plan, they're not using different figures, and we don't all get lost in the weeds.
And this used to be something that was a standard part of the budget-making process, and perhaps one of the least controversial aspects of the budget-making process, right?
Perhaps should be.
You would start out in February or March, and you would agree on the revenue number, and then everybody would work from that, and then in May, things would fall apart, and the Democrats would ram through the budget they wanted to ram through. But there hasn't even been, as Mark was saying, there hasn't been one of these revenue estimates for a number of years now. Of course, there hasn't been a budget for a number of years until last year. So last year, things just kind of came together quickly in the end over the summer after 2 years of impasse. But I don't quite see the strategic value of forcing the revenue estimate, because one thing Democrats are pointing out is that, well, the governor wants a revenue estimate. What should that number be? Should it include this tax increase that you vetoed last summer and was passed over your veto and that you're still campaigning against? And the answer seems to be yes, that the Republicans and the governor are willing to go along with that. Their revenue estimate should include those higher tax numbers, which Senate President Cullerton, after that meeting you referred to, called hypocritical on the part of the governor for him to continue campaigning against the tax hike while at the same time making plans to spend the money and agreeing to spend the money that was brought in by that tax hike.
Well, but the money's going to come in. I mean, what's done is done. I mean, this tax hike, the governor can, describe it any way he likes. But in fact, this is something that should have been on some level last year's news. We are where we are. Why are they still fighting about this?
Well, it's good politics for the governor. I mean, he wants to be able to say that he still opposes this thing, and he's working hard for the taxpayers, and wants to lower the tax rate. Meanwhile, Democrats and a fair number of Republicans who if they're honest with you quietly about the budget, will acknowledge that Illinois, right now needs this money. And even Republicans who are loud about it. I mean, State Representative Ives in her primary campaign said, she wants to roll back taxes eventually, but it's immoral to carry the debt we have. And she used that word, immoral.
Well, the governor's own office has used that in a presentation. They put it in print. When they went to bond buyers to make a presentation, they said, these are the recent positive developments. One, we passed a budget in FY18, and two, we have higher revenue, meaning we passed the tax hike. That was listed under the category of positive things. Governor Rauner says this is anathema. It is the absolute worst thing, and he's running on a promise to undo that. So there's a difference of opinion within the governor's own office on whether or not that tax hike was good for Illinois.
Well, and the governor is also, not to interrupt, hasn't he been somewhat inconsistent? He's telling the bond folks, the rating agencies, we got a $659 million hole, I think is what he's put in the budget. But he's out on the, when he's talking to reporters, and somewhat out on the stump, so to speak. But he's saying we're billions of dollars out of whack. Is that inconsistent, or what explains that?
It's exaggeration, and what explains it is that he's a politician.
Okay, fair enough. Mike Madigan came out of that meeting today and didn't have kind words to say. You had said something about sidelines, and that's exactly what the words that the speaker used.
Yeah,
he was somewhat dismissive of it.
And he's the one legislative leader who did not stop and talk to the press. He used a back exit from the governor's office, so we did not actually get to see him. But within minutes of having learned he left the meeting, we had a 2-paragraph statement in our inboxes, as though it had been written ahead of time. Suspicious. But anyways, he basically said that he advised the governor that he and the Republicans in the legislature are already working on a budget, and if the governor wants to work cooperatively with us, then he would be welcome to do so. But has an extreme agenda, and he wants to push his agenda on the backs of women, children, and the elderly, and et cetera, et cetera. It did not augur a new era of peace and harmony in Springfield, this meeting this morning. And I guess one of the big questions that I've had this spring is how relevant will the governor be to the budget process? Is it better for him to just be able to veto it again, or does he then look ineffectual and irrelevant to the process as he actually was last summer? Or does he want to own this tax increase or not own it? It's an interesting question. People are not. All I can get people to say to me is, we hope the governor will be relevant, at least on the Republican side.
Well, yeah, breaking news, Mike Madigan and Bruce Rushton don't agree or see eye to eye.
Right.
Going into that, as you referenced, going into that meeting, the statement coming after it was already pre-drafted and ready to go and ready to drop. They just had to press send. Governor Rauner has publicly stated that his top legislative goal for this session, before the end of the session, basically, is to pass a budget. So, okay, well, he's going to have to climb up a pyramid of broken glass shards if he wants to get it. And Speaker Madigan's going to basically hold the threat of last year's veto override over him. But again, if you're looking for positive signs, both of the two most powerful people or brokers in this situation are both publicly saying that they still want to get a budget. How they get there will be interesting. I would just add Governor Rauner's budget address, his big fix, his big tax cut plan was to shift the cost of pensions from the state to local property tax, to local school districts and to local municipalities. On Thursday, talking to reporters, he said that's up for grabs. It's on the table. He said he would sign a budget even if it didn't include that, so long as it was balanced. So even his most ardent demand, his biggest plan, his silver bullet to bring a tax cut, he says he's not really tied to it and he could walk away from it. So this is where House Republicans start to tell us in the press that they're getting mixed signals from the governor, and they don't exactly know which direction to put their energy behind.
One thing that struck me about Madigan's statement was it was very heavy on social services. We're not going to do a budget that's going to be balanced on the backs of the least fortunate among us. It's almost ready as laying a marker down to some extent. Don't screw with the social service agencies as you have done in past years as governor. Is this just the same old Madigan stuff, or am I reading too much into this?
I don't know. I think this has basically been his message all along, right? That the governor, and if you look at who was affected most in the impasse, it is what people call the most vulnerable people in Illinois, right? Social service agencies that are taking care of people with disabilities, people who are elderly, people who are shut-ins, that sort of thing. They were not funded in many cases for almost the entirety of the impasse. A lot of them had to close programs. A lot of them laid off staff. And so what the speaker, has said is that this was part of the governor's agenda to try and push his so-called turnaround agenda through, and that he doesn't want anything to do with that. We heard the governor this week, beginning the week with a news conference, calling for his legislative agenda, a lot of which did sound very familiar. It sounded like the turnaround agenda from a few.
How many points are we down to on the turnaround agenda?
Yeah, it started out with 44.
Okay.
And a number of those things he has gotten done without the legislature, but the biggest ones have eluded him because, as Mark might say, newsflash, it's a Democratic legislature, and they're just not going to go along with these ideas, and that remains the case.
Okay. Speaking of budget problems, we also have Department of Corrections dropping the news on legislators this week. We're $420 million in the hole. We need $420 million now, not later. And that was purported to have come as a surprise to legislators. Should they have been surprised?
They should not have been surprised. It was an interesting hearing. This was actually included in Governor Rauner's budget address, this need, and it's actually $1 billion supplemental that he's asking for.
Sure, that includes more than corrections.
Including more than corrections, yeah. And apparently it was part of the negotiations in the budget last summer before that broke down and things kind of came out without, the full cooperation of all the legislative leaders. But what I think the Democrats were saying in the Senate budget hearing this week is, you are treating this as though it's part of the normal budget. Well, the governor proposed it in his address. We're here making our budget, our annual budget. This wasn't an emergency hearing or anything. This was the regular budget hearing. Each of the agency heads comes into various hearings. This was the one that corrections had been scheduled to make their presentation at. And what the Senate said was, sounds like a 5-alarm fire that you're describing. You're here saying we need a supplemental appropriations. You should be raising the alarm. Some of the senators said, you, director of the Department of Corrections, John Baldwin, I've never met you before. You've never come to my office and said that, this is an emergency. We need this help. State Senator Andy Minar even said he's heard more from inmates about the need for this funding because of cutbacks in things like toilet paper and cleaning supplies, basic necessities to keep these facilities running. He's heard more from inmates than he has from officials of the Department of Corrections.
Sure. And part of this too, at least the $420 million, Corrections got what it wanted last year. The legislature granted the request, the budget that the administration wanted, and now they're back. Well, it's not enough money. Appears to be some confusion, I think, on some levels. Is this because you overspent, or is this because you've got bills you didn't pay that you should have paid on time? And
that's exactly it. Is that they used. We're currently in the 2018 budget year, and they used some of that money to pay off their 2017 expenses. And this is part of the charge. Remember last fall, the governor said the Democrats passed an unbalanced budget. Well, one of the reasons he called it unbalanced is because they didn't include that money for the previous year's expenses.
Yeah.
It's not like rollover minutes in your cell plan.
Right, exactly. Although it is, right? Legally it is. They could apparently legally pay those expenses. They just didn't have, the spending. It gets really complicated. But the point is that ultimately the Democrats want the governor to come on bended knee and say, "I'm so sorry, I did the budget impasse. It was all my fault. Please give us this extra money. I have not done a good job." Of course. They're not going to acknowledge that, and so this is where you get into this political fight. And corrections is this is kind of the idea that, well, if the governor thinks he can run the state without a budget, let's let him try. And they're kind of letting them twist in the wind. Meanwhile, there are actual victims here, which is it's hard to think. People might not want to think of prison inmates as victims, but these are people that the state has a legal and moral obligation to at least treat humanely with things like electricity and running water, and these are some of the things that have been threatened to be cut off at prisons as the Department of Corrections has stiffed vendors.
One other point on this, the whole prison population though as well, is that perhaps the one remaining area of bipartisan continuing cooperation is this issue of prison reform and of criminal justice reform. And I think in the last 3 years, Illinois has seen a reduction in the prison population of well into double digits, I believe as high as 17–18%. And
they've down something like 8,000, I think, something like that, total numbers.
But turning inmates into taxpayers, if you can complete that transition,
or into parolees, but
or paying an expense to have them housed, but then they are paying into the tax coffers. That's a successful, good government story that, while separate from the budget problems they've had, also is a it's one bright spot in Illinois state government lately.
Although, and I would say some of that decline, though, is not attributable to anything the legislature and the governor have done. Some of that is the natural churn in the population, and the projections do call for those numbers to start going back up because the legislature has not done some of the toughest things that the governor's own reform commission suggested. So this is, you're right, it has been a bright spot. They have worked together on some of these things. There's still a lot more that needs to be done, and I think that there's a risk, especially among people who follow this stuff closely and look at the projections of how the inmate population is going to grow. Not to get too much into the weeds, but truth in sentencing happened about 20 years ago. And so the last group of people who were sentenced to time in prison are getting out who were not truth in sentencing. Now you're going to have people who are, instead of staying for 20 years, they're going to have to stay for 40 years, and those numbers are going to keep going up and or start going back up.
But as you say, I mean, it is almost a Sisyphean, if that's a word, endeavor here. One example would be, okay, we're doing prison reform, we're getting the population down, and then the legislature last year passes gun legislation that promises to increase the numbers of prisons because more folks caught with guns are going to end up in prison. Now, perhaps fewer folks with drugs will end up there, but they'll be replaced by other folks. And at the same time, we have a prison system that is spending less than it probably should in some areas. There was a report out by the Pew Charitable Trust last fall, I believe, that ranked Illinois 48th in per inmate spending on health care. So this is a problem that's going to get better or worse, or what does the future hold? I mean, how long can this bright spot remain?
Well, Governor Rauner, running for his campaign in 2014, once compared underfunded schools in Chicago to prisons. And that might be the one thing that schools and prisons have in common in Illinois, is that they're funded at the lowest levels in the nation across the board. And so those are areas where the state can make a difference in someone's life when they encounter that person, whether in prison or in a school. And increasing the equitable funding levels is something that a lot of people in Springfield have their eyes on, but getting that done is a bigger challenge.
I was just going to add, in solving if you truly want to bring down the number of people in prison, you need to look beyond, and this is not my original phrase, but the non-nons, right? The non-violent, non-sexual offenders, right? You have to be willing to say, should we be sending people to prison for 80 years? Because, it's, as you can look at the charts, the people who are in there the longest, as they become elderly, their health care expenses shoot way up, and then you spend a disproportionate amount of the money we spend on corrections to incarcerate people who are probably not that much of a threat to society anymore. So we, the people of Illinois, through our elected officials, need to decide, do we want, for the sake of simply retribution, to be incarcerating elderly people and people for that many years? Or do we want to figure something else out to do? And that's something that the legislature has not really been willing to grapple with yet.
I think you're right, and there's only so many nonviolent drug offenders out there.
Exactly.
At some point in time, when are we going to start giving folks dealing with property crimes, for example? Well, burglars aren't going to go to prison anymore because we can't afford it. That's going to be a hard sell?
I mean, that would be an easier sell than, batterers are not going to go to prison anymore. But there are some people who say that even for the most serious crimes, our sentences are disproportionate with what other Western nations do.
Fair enough. Well, I mean, moving on to guns, I mean, that's not necessarily a prison thing, but that's also on the agenda here for the governor and the legislature. Just prior to the election, Governor Rauner vetoes some gun legislation, particularly requiring licensure for gun dealers. That doesn't seem to be off the table yet, is it?
There was some talk that the legislature might try to mount another veto override. Senate President John Cullerton this week said that he wants to see a gun deal package signed by the governor in tandem with the budget making process. He wanted to kind of tie those in somehow, using them as leverage. So there's still a long way to go. I think that from what you hear from Democrats downstate, it's really more of a rural-urban divide than it is a party one. And there are some downstate Democrats who have to win elections in November who might be nervous about putting their vote on some of those gun regulation bills.
Sure, but there has been polling that's been out, not just in Illinois but elsewhere, that seems to indicate that you can be Republican, you can be from a rural area, and you can still pass certain amounts of legislation without getting yourself in trouble. Has that message sunk in any way, shape, or form, do you think?
Well, there are those who are trying to make it sink in. There are certainly people building the case that this bill will be popular, and in fact it might be. The veto override, though, is always a tough sell. You've got to get all those votes, and getting that supermajority in both chambers to override the governor. I mean, they're making the case now. We haven't seen them push for that override on the floor yet, but it could happen.
Okay.
And this is still an active issue, as Mark pointed out. It was after Thursday morning's leaders meeting that the Senate President came out and said, the governor has put together this task force to look at school safety and gun violence in the wake of the Florida shooting. And the Senate Democrats have kind of boycotted it, and they've said, we've passed bills. You vetoed one of them. There are others on your desk, and the governor asked the Senate President, please appoint some Senate Democrats to this commission.
Are there others on his? There's other gun reform bills on his desk.
That's what Senate President Cullerton said. He said, sign those bills that are on your desk now. I think it was some raising the age of purchase for assault weapons, if I remember correctly. But I'm just going off the top of my head there.
Sure.
But this is they did not have the votes. It was not a veto-proof majority that passed that gun dealer licensing bill in the first place. So that could remain a tough sell. I would just also say this is an example of the continuing polarization that has been one of Governor Rauner's lasting hallmarks, right? Defeating State Representative John Bradley in the House Democrats, who is a Southern Illinois Democrat, defeating State Senator Gary Forby, who is a far Southern Illinois Democrat. By eliminating those voices from the Democratic caucus, you make it a more liberal caucus. It's a less gun-friendly caucus. So now who among the Senate Democrats is there saying, hey, we need to soften this gun control bill a little bit because of my constituents aren't going to like it. You don't have that voice as much anymore. So this is where this is increasingly, it used to be more of a geographic issue in Illinois, and it still is to some extent, but it's increasingly becoming more of a partisan issue as it's become national.
Instead of that vocal opposition, you see senators like Andy Benar who chose not to vote. So not taking a stance, but also not making that vocal opposition.
Yeah. Well, I mean, come November, and that's what folks are looking at, if Rauner were to veto gun legislation, if more comes up, if he can't produce any progress here on the gun issue other than we're going to have a committee and study it, how does that play? I mean, is that going to be disastrous, or is that just, well, that's the way it was going to be anyway, there's no votes really gained or lost?
I'm sorry to say it may depend on current events, right? It seems like we have one of these shootings and then suddenly people get energized about it and people think about it and it's top of mind, and the more time that goes on, the issue kind of fades. I mean, everybody in Springfield was talking about gun control before the primaries shortly after the Parkland shooting, and it's not something that people are talking nearly as much about after coming back from the 3-week recess when they were off. So it kind of depends on current events, perhaps.
Well, speaking of perennial issues, we have the Equal Rights Amendment. It's just been passed by the Senate, which is, let's see, 1982, which was the deadline for Congress had set for states to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment. Why is this issue still around? What does this Senate vote mean? I mean, it seems that one school of thought, it's more likely this time around the House might actually take action, given Madigan, I think, has had some issues with the Me Too movement. But is this a real issue, or is this more of a stance issue, a symbolic issue?
Symbolic is the word of the day. A lot of people have used that. Some Republicans who oppose this have grumbled that it's some larger conspiracy to expand abortion rights in Illinois, and that it's got a broader sort of a slingshot play down the road. And I don't exactly understand that logic, but this was something Governor Rauner came out and said that he supports. He said that at a press conference on Thursday that he supports equal rights for everyone, although the bill wouldn't actually reach his desk, so he doesn't have to take a stance. He can kind of get away with saying whatever he wants in that position. But this is also one of those headlines where the optics just looks like you can file it under "This is so Illinois," right? Like 35 years too late. Getting something done.
Well, it should also be bears mentioning that the Illinois Constitution does have a clause in it that could be interpreted as an equal rights clause, saying that there should be, I'm paraphrasing here, men and women should be treated the same under the law, so something like that. So, and to some degree, this is a federal issue because we're talking about ratification of the U.S. Constitution, not the state constitution, and so. we'll see, I suppose. And if the governor can cheer and applaud, and he'll be on the sidelines, I guess, if it's not much for him to do.
Yeah, no, I mean, he doesn't really have a role in this. It's, if it passes the House, it doesn't have to go through the governor's office or anything. As you pointed out, Illinois was the place where the Equal Rights Amendment pretty much died in the 1980s. It was the subject of people chaining themselves together in the Capitol building, pouring animal blood, writing messages on the floor. So it is somewhat fitting that if it does gain any new life, that it would find it, its resurrection here in Illinois. But you're right. It's a legal. There are some real serious questions about whether there's any legal weight if it is passed, if it could be revived, if Congress could somehow extend the deadline, and then it would still, I think, require another couple of states to ratify it, but don't quote me on that.
2 more, actually.
Yeah, okay.
There's 2 left to go. And as this stuff is unfolding, the governor has announced he's going to Europe, Poland and Germany, on a trade mission. Can we afford to be without him?
Well, I think the question is, can Illinois afford to lose out on attracting new businesses? And that's been part of the message that he has sent on his campaign in 2014. He promised to go across the country, across the globe, and compete with...
He's been to China already, has he not?
He's been to Asia, he's been to Israel, and now this is his 3rd trade mission in about a year, I believe. But there are questions about what... he came back with a few small trophies from one of those trips to Asia, and there is a partnership with the University of Illinois after the trip to Israel based on technology, and so he'll be looking to bring back some Rauner trophies coming back from Poland and from Germany. He says they're growing economies, and he wants to have some new pro-growth, pro-business thing to look at and tout in his run for re-election. But these are the things that he promised he would do all along. He's really only got around to them in the twilight of his first term because of so many of the legislative battles that he chose to dig into for the first portion of his term.
Legislative battles, indeed. Well, we'll be here at least until, hopefully we'll get it all wrapped up by July 1st to get a budget in place, and we'll be back here next week to talk about it again. So thanks for joining us in Capitol with Capitol View.